Hi, everyone. Welcome to I'll give everybody a minute to get here, but I want to start by welcoming everybody to the second installment of the Great Decisions speaker series for this year. I'll give people, like I said, another moment or two to log on, and then we will jump into it. Okay, I want to start real quick by thanking the World Affairs Council of St. Louis, who is putting on these talks. The World Affairs Council is a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization that connects the citizens of the St. Louis metropolitan region to the world. It was founded in 1948 with a mission to offer programs which promote understanding, engagement, relationships, and leadership in world affairs, which St. Louis is a city positioned to do just that. They rely on donations from the community and have annual memberships available, which help to fund events like this. There will be links in the chat where you can learn more about the World Affairs Council, how to become a member, and also want to thank co-sponsor the Global Office, UMSL Global, at the University of Missouri St. Louis. For more information about them, you can also visit their website, which should also be in the chat. Okay, with that out of the way, it is now my pleasure to introduce Elina Ribakova, who is the Deputy Chief Economist at the Institute of International Finance. Her research focuses on global markets, economic statecraft, and economic sovereignty. She was previously a research fellow at the London School of Economics and has held senior level roles in economic research at a number of financial institutions, most recently with Deutsche Bank in London, and as head of the EEMEA Research and Leadership at Amundi, Pioneer Asset Management, and Citigroup. She also spent 9 years working with the International Monetary Fund and Washington, D.C. It is with great pleasure I turn it over to her to talk about this very timely topic of economic warfare. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for a very kind introduction. So I will start just giving you the overview of what has happened, what has not happened, and also where we might be headed with economic statecraft in 2023. I hope it will be a lively discussion, and my colleagues here, I'm sure, have questions, and I'm sure the listeners might have questions. So that's the most important. So just to give you an introduction, when we talk about economic statecraft, we still are not sure what parts of the economic activity or foreign policy or national security constitute economic statecraft. We seem to be more looking at it backwards. Oh, there is a tool of export controls. Let's use that. Oh, there is a tool of global financial sector dominance by the United States, the US dollar, US capital markets. Or maybe there are export or import controls, that we know of, or investment controls. So there are all these different kind of bits and pieces that we're using them because we seem to have them. But there isn't a comprehensive strategy yet in terms of how we should think about economic statecraft. And when I talk about economic statecraft, I want to say that it's a way of projecting economic power. It's a way of protecting your national security interests. And it's also a way of maybe furthering your foreign policy objectives. So this is where, in theory, economics, foreign policy, political science, and security experts should be working together, looking at the comprehensive strategy, thinking where the maybe security measures should be warranted, and it should really go to defense and the military, for example, supplying Ukraine with weapons, and where there are other places where, for example, we're not planning to have a nuclear war with Russia, we might want to do other measures to undermine Russia's ability to wage the war in Ukraine. So this, in theory, in the ideal world, and especially, I'm sure after our listeners will get interested in this research topic and will further it, maybe 10 or 20 years from now, we'll be looking back and thinking, oh, that's why it didn't work, because we didn't have a comprehensive strategy. Well, it's always, of course, easier to be smart exposed, but I do think it's a very important multidisciplinary research agenda that a lot of people should be focused on right now. And should also be humble about it, especially when we're trying to say, has something worked or hasn't worked? So in an ideal world, then, we should have some sort of foreign policy or national security or economic objectives. We should have stated them clearly, and then we should have measurable impact. And then based on sort of historical evidence of measurable impact or just fundamental theoretical analysis, we should be able to say, well, these measures seem to have the most impact, or this is where the US has the most leverage, and this is where the risks of the spillback back to the United States or our multinational or multilateral partners seems to be the most limited, and therefore we can use this tool. So to give you an example, and there are people like Dalip Singh who wrote about it in The Economist not long ago, and I think Jack Sullivan also made comments about it. But to give you an example where this was a very clearly successful strategy, are the financial sector sanctions against Russia in 2014. The US was looking for the point of leverage, and sort of vibrant, deep, transparent financial markets in the US, of course, definitely is a point sort of strength. At the same time, Russian corporates especially were borrowing a lot from the global financial markets. This was their vulnerability. So putting in sectoral sanctions that prevented Russia from accessing capital markets was an important shock. So just in about a year, Russia was forced to repay $250 billion just because it lost access to the global capital markets. Well, I say global, but mostly it's US and Europe, which are sort of the bulk of the global capital markets. And therefore, after 2014, countries like Rosneft, Gazprom, and Russian banks had a hard time raising capital abroad. They tried to go to Asian market, maybe raise something in renminbi, so they tried to substitute access to the financial markets in the US and Europe, but they were clearly unsuccessful. And that definitely has stalled their development. So when we do our economic statecraft, it doesn't mean that the other party is not prepared either. So Russian authorities, they figured out, okay, there is a risk of us being disconnected, whether it might be SWIFT, global payment system, or further access to the capital markets. So they went back and started to do their homework. They tried to cut the budget spending enough for them to go into budget surplus, so they wouldn't need to borrow as much. They went and implemented domestic payment system, just for the banks, but also for the credit cards, for example, where Visa, MasterCard, anybody else would have to use Russian domestic payment system. And they also went and implemented inflation targeting, they accumulated reserves. So they prepared what's called Fortress Russia strategy in order to insulate, like vaccinate themselves against further sanctions, but also potentially isolate themselves from further exposure to the global capital markets. So that was their strategy. Their bet was that given the importance of Russia in global energy markets, and Russia is one of the top 3 producers and exporters of oil, also equally important in gas, Russian authorities saw that it's most likely Europe and the US will not dare disconnecting them from the global markets. This is somewhere where they somewhat miscalculated on, obviously, since we do have the embargo now and the oil price cap. But also, this is somewhere we also came somewhat less prepared. As I started talking more about the financial sanctions, this is something that the US has been pretty successful in using, the tool of weaponization of finance, especially in the last 20 years, where the US and the particular European Union have had much less experience is doing trade measures. So we can think about sort of economic statecraft, we have financial sector sanctions, we have sort of trade measures, we talked about investment controls and others. So in the trade measures, it might be higher tariffs, it might be embargoes, and it also might be export controls to Russia. So this area of the trade measures is something that we have used in the past, but not as much, and usually mostly focused on specifically military equipment, particularly in Europe. So the US sort of trying to use some of the trade measures against China. This is sort of dibbling into this area, but definitely not an instrument that has been sort of honed and improved over the years, the same degree that the financial sector sanctions have been used in the past. So now what we have towards Russia is that we've seen that financial sector sanctions had some effects, and some of the effect on Russian economy was partially because of the fact that because of the financial sector sanctions, companies refused to trade with Russia, and they de facto these financial sector sanctions turned into trade measures. But also because of the preparedness of Russia, the effect was maybe not as dramatic as it would have been if we were to take these measures and say again in 2014. So now we all moved into the area of export controls and embargoes. And this is a new area where our implementation and enforcement is not yet as skilled as developed as compared even to the financial sector sanctions. After 2010, for a long time, many financial institutions were happy to continue doing business, even though the sanctions were already in place, when be it maybe, illicit financing or even sort of North Korea or Venezuela. But then over the years, or Iran, we've seen many multi-billion fines levied by US authorities. And eventually, relatively quickly, after a couple of years or a couple of fines here and there, the financial industry sort of fell into place and started complying with the financial sector sanctions. Also, the infrastructure is a bit more prepared in terms of monitoring, compliance, know your client, FATF regulations to pursue breach of the and to punish potential breach with financial sector sanctions. And we have seen, obviously, not only fines, but also banks being closed, mostly because of the violation of the US financial sector sanctions. We have not seen as much yet on the side of the trade measures. Of course, we have seen Huawei, we've seen also some Chinese companies being added to the list, but the infrastructure is not yet there. We haven't seen, for example, big fines slapped on the international technology companies, for example, because maybe they are sending their exports to Russia, not directly, but indirectly. It's not a scenario that we are sort of completely certain about, but it's potentially happening already, whether it's via Turkey, UAE, or China itself. Also, there isn't enough yet sort of technological infrastructure, whether it's at BIS or OFAC or customs offices, to be able to track this, and it is a highly complex process. So with that background in mind, I will also show you just maybe 1 or 2 slides on what has happened in Russia, and then we will transition to Q&A. So here, I hope you can see my slide here. We have the, there we go. So we have the fact that, despite all the talk about the trade embargo and the oil price cap last year, we have seen that Russia actually continued to enjoy large foreign exchange inflows. So I'm showing here the trade balance and exports and imports of Russia. We see that the Russian exports performed exceptionally strongly last year, and it's a combination of volume and price effect. And the imports after the original shock, and I talked about where financial sector sanctions have de facto turned into trade measures because companies stepped away from working with Russia, and also partially because of financial sector sanctions, Russian domestic demand fell, and again you had a contraction in imports. But you see very quickly there is a recovery in imports, and a big chunk of it is indeed coming from countries like China. The fact that we also took most of the year to discuss the embargo on the price cap, but not actually implement it until December, that means that on the export side, Russia continued to get access to large foreign exchange inflows. And we can see it here, the breakdown. So where did Russia get the money from? So this is contribution to change in oil payments or oil export proceeds by Russia from in 2022 compared to 21. So we have here sort of the big contribution from crude oil price. This is the red one. We have products price that also increased. We have some even increase in crude volume and a reduction in products. And what does it tell us? It tells us that Russia benefited from high prices and also used the opportunity to divert its crude oil exports to new markets, because they were not dumb. They realized that European Unions are putting an embargo, US, UK, and others already put an embargo in place. They know they're going to lose the market, and therefore they increased the volume that went to China. They increased the volume a bit to India and China, and also where they could actually, they also charged higher prices. So there's a vibrant discussion at the moment where Russian discount on Russian oil is deep, but it's unfortunately, at least in our findings, is not deep enough compared to some of the numbers being thrown out in the press or the analysts, and we can talk more about during the Q&A. Another slide I want to show you here before we proceed maybe to questions is that also what happened with Russia's imports. And what happened with Russia's imports is that China has stepped in to supply Russia more proactively. If you look at the share on the right-hand side, and this is the sort of how much each individual country's accounts in total Russia's imports. So the share of China from 21, the solid bar, to the dotted bar in 2022 has gone from sort of a bit over 20% to as much as 37%. So China now accounts for the largest share of Russian imports, as many other countries have stepped back. We also have seen some interesting things like Turkey, for example, popping up and supplying much more than they used to supply, and that might suggest some redirection of products via Turkey towards Russia. If we look specifically at the sensitive products that might be important for Russia's either modernization or war effort, we see similar picture, potentially more disturbing picture, where Russia has continued to have access to critical technology. Of course, chips are very different. Chips, as you know, can be anything from from a nano chips that are critical for something, or to like your bread and butter chips, which are less important. So here, we're just taking all the chips according to the trade classification. But again, you see Russia has substantially increased the volume of imports. And also it appears to be getting this supply from China, Hong Kong, and of course, much less from the other countries. Here, this is still our work in progress. I hope to have a follow-up paper. I mean, one of this publication is already out. The commodity export paper will be coming out next week, and hopefully we'll be able to spend more time on the chips data, because it is so important, because one needs to do much more reconciliation, the price versus volume effect. But nonetheless, this is the early findings, what we're seeing. If one were to turn to Russia's military imports, and again, data on that is far more scarce than on anything else, but we do try to look at the customs data and look for the drones imports. Of course, they're all reported to be for non-military use, but as we know, the drones play a very important role in Russia's war in Ukraine, where drones can be used for reconnaissance and early information on the positions of Ukrainian infrastructure or military or civilians. And at the same time, drones can also be used as supporting sort of much cheap alternative of sort of dropping bombs in the right places. So you could have just a combination of drones working together, where they're much faster to react, they're much faster to send information, and also they're much cheaper, and they also distract Ukrainian military because they do have to shut them down, because they might be worried that it's not a reconnaissance drone, but it's a drone with the risk or the explosives. So anyway, so this here we'll look at basically we're trying to use available data. This is the number of transactions by country by months since the beginning of the war, and this is March in 2022 until September. This is what we have the data for. And here again, you see the number of transactions picking up significantly from Hong Kong, China, what used to be very little, or from less usual places like Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, or Oman, Vietnam. Again, this is just number of transactions. We do not, we need to dig deeper into how many and what kind of drones went in there. But again, it's something that one can pursue. And finally, what I want to say is that we do still have foreign companies continue to work with Russia. And it's not just countries that are not aligned with multilateral sanctions against Russia. For example, here I'm showing you the percent of companies by country broken down into their public statements or actual accounting actions. So for example, if it says exited, it means they have either written off their ownership in Russia or they have sold it, right? So there's an accounting transaction taken place. And this covers more than 2,500 companies. The data is from end of the summer, and we plan to update it again soon. But as we know now, sort of here, only about 40 companies have completely stopped their operations in Russia out of this sample of 2,400. We see that China is mostly green, is mostly staying, but it's not only China. There are other countries here that still have these green bars. So with that, I will stop and we can go to questions. Thank you so much. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much for that great presentation. I have a few questions, maybe while we wait for the audience to type theirs up. Please use the Q&A feature rather than the chat box, audience, as you are preparing those questions. That will make it a lot easier for me to monitor. One question that I have is, what kind of time frame do you think is appropriate to measure whether strategies of economic statecraft are successful, right? Sanctions are not the immediate success story that I think many people hope for when we talk about foreign policy. And I think about other examples of economic statecraft in, say, US history, where we have this long-running total economic isolation of Cuba, and I've seen no change in the Cuban regime. So at what point is it fair to say this isn't working, maybe we should try something else, or anything along those lines? Any thoughts you have there, I would be really interested in hearing.
Okay, so I think it's a good question, which I'll answer with a question. I think it depends. What is your objective? We might have a big overarching objective of combined national security, foreign policy, economics. We would like to see a regime change. Fine. Let's break it down. Then me as an economist, I would need the political sciences to tell me that this is what triggers regime change. It's, for example, from economics point of view, I cannot say, even from political science, by the way, that if the economic hardship reaches this level, we see a regime change. If you think about the Soviet Union, or if you mentioned Iran, Venezuela, there is plenty of economic hardship, right? But we're not seeing regime change. The Soviet Union broke apart way after, when we thought externally that that your Soviet Union should break up, because they had some economic pain, they had stagnation, but it wasn't a sudden disintegration of the economy. It's actually, if anything, sort of happens almost alongside the political regime change. So that's why when people ask me, oh, sanctions are working, I said, look, it depends on your objective. In terms of economic impact, yes, we're seeing an impact. There's definitely, if we're expecting some growth, maybe 3%, 3.5% growth last year in 2022, even by Putin estimate, you're going to have a minus 2.5% contraction. I think the ECB just did a nice paper where I think they estimated more at 6.5%, using other high frequency indicators. So there's a big swing. We're expecting counterfactual versus what happened to Russian economy in reality. We're seeing economic impact. That's, if that was the objective, we're seeing some results, right? If the objective is to stop the war in Ukraine, well, it seems that they still have enough inventory and access to foreign produced military goods to continue with the war in Ukraine.
Great, thank you so much. So I will take this question from Bert Fullman in the audience, asking, you just provided some of this with the sort of the gross domestic product changes in GDP, but is Russia really hurting that much today from the sources of data that you've looked at?
Unfortunately, Russia is not hurting as much as I forecasted last year and was also hoping for. And I think here the fact that the financial sector sanctions did not spill into, they did temporarily spill into financial instability, and we've seen large withdrawals from domestic banks. There were run on the banks that maybe lasted about 3 weeks, but Russian authorities were successful from preventing that from spilling into the real economy. We've seen what happens when like global financial crisis, when there is a negative feedback loop between real financial sector and real economy, it can be rather painful. Of course, Russian economy doesn't have such deep financial markets as the US, but also I think the preparedness helped them protect themselves more skillfully. So that's why the pain is not as much. However, the pain is there. I mentioned it already in some of the GDP numbers, but I think it's also, if you go sector by sector, you see that the sectors that were most advanced technologically, maybe it's whether it's car manufacturing, which used to be the success story, and here self-sanctioning by companies matters, or pharmaceuticals production, which highly reliant on the foreign production and imports. So the more advanced sectors, I think, will continue to struggle. And finally, Russia did the most important sanction themselves. The mobilization definitely dented economic outlook, whether it's business consumer sentiment or medium-term investment, because you are getting the skilled people, whether it's from agriculture, from factories, 200, 300,000 of these people, you're going to ship them to the front line, and many of them are going to die.
Thank you. That was a very thoughtful and thorough answer. We have a follow-up question from Krista, kind of talking about the regime change aspect of economic statecraft. Have economic sanctions ever led to regime change in other instances that you're aware of?
That's a very good question. Yeah, again, more political policy than me. And I know that nowadays you have everybody's expert on everything, and that's why, you know, when I talk to political scientists, I'm like, that's why I don't take these questions. But I'll try to speculate. And I think, no, I'm not aware. You know, I think there is South Africa to an extent, but, you know, there was a mix of other pressure. There was sort of also South African sanctions to an extent were somewhat porous. I do know that there's been a book a while back looking at the old case studies from, I think, Peterson, a few Peterson experts, and one has to go back to the 70s and 80s in terms of some of the successful quote unquote regime changes. But to what, and I hope that there will be revival of that literature a little bit, because those regime changes potentially came more with the security pressure, not only economic sanctions, and also they came in the environment where countries were less globally integrated, whether it's trade or financial markets. So it's different. But otherwise, you know, as my colleague that follows Iran for a while in the early days of the war, fantastic research on Iran, he said, yeah, those excited about Russian regime change should jump on Iranian Twitter for a second and, you know, get some cold shower.
Yeah, I'll jump in as the political scientist up here and say, on their own, economic sanctions are typically very good at getting policy change, but full-scale regime change is much more difficult to accomplish purely with economic sanctions. They're a good tool in the toolbox, but on their own, probably not sufficient. All right, a question from Nate Taylor. What do you think other countries could do to hurt Russia more severely?
Well, I think what countries can do is, especially US and Europe, is be more realistic about expectations from other countries. So you cannot come to Turkey and just expect them to cooperate fully with Russian sanctions that the way that US or Europe desires. Turkey gets a lot of tourism inflows from Russia. It gets now a lot of capital flight from Russia. It gets sort of people coming in, spending money. You have also the flights going through Turkey. Turkey also is getting much more space as a small leader in the region. You know, we can look at the conflict, Iran, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Turkey's role there, Turkey's role in Syria. So for Turkey, it also works, Russia being not too powerful, but also not getting on the wrong side of Russia. So we cannot come and tell them, look, we want you to stop all the sort of rediversion of trade. But what we can do is to say, look, these are specific items that are critical importance to us. If you continue, your banks are going to go on the sanction list because maybe they're sort of facilitated the sanctions avoidance in the region because they're processing payments, right? Or you can say that you're not going to get access to European trade because for Turkey it's critical importance, right? So one has to be pragmatic. The same kind of conversations can happen with UAE, with Iran, or with India, sorry, for different reasons. Here, the question is whether the US is willing to go more the direction of the secondary sanctions, or rather whether the European Union would be happy with that. And to be honest, I'm not sure European Union will be happy with that, or should be even happy with that. We can talk more about it if there is a question.
I would love to return to the topic of secondary sanctions in a minute, perhaps using the SNAP sanctions that the Obama administration put on Iran. So keep that in the back of your mind, but we will move on to a couple more audience questions first before we leave the Russia topic. One question again from Bert is perhaps the elephant in the room, which you mentioned, Elina, is the exodus of 300,000 or more, mostly men from Russia being drafted into the military and sent to the front lines. So you're losing hundreds of thousands in population, brain power, skilled labor, et cetera, which you mentioned. At what point would we expect to see that show up in the economic data that you would be looking at?
Well, we see already, I think now last year in the economic data, we've seen some of the agricultural produce. I mean, although they still had a good harvest, but the harvest was not collected in time in many regions. And that being two reasons. One is the combiners, which John Deere is a very important combiner there. And then another one is the driver of a combiner is also close enough to the driver of the military, whatever, military vehicles that might be needed on the front lines. And also because they're afraid of the uprisings in the bigger cities, of course, they went for the regions and for the villages first. So you're already seeing some impact. You've seen cash withdrawals from banks because people are trying to lay low and use cash and not be easily traced. or maybe exit the country. We've seen a pickup in the exit. So you see it in the numbers. How long until it breaks the back of the Russian economy? I don't think it's a question of months. I still worry if nothing is done further in terms of a special enforcement implementation. It's the question of not months, it's a question of years.
Great, thank you. So one more question on Russia and Ukraine. We can revisit it later if the audience has more, but Emir asks what the possibility of a Serbia scenario playing out is, where Putin is sort of overthrown and a popular or populist new leader comes to power, but criminal elements and old regime loyalists sort of take that new leader out, throwing the entire region back into crisis. I think this is sort of what many are hoping for with economic statecraft occurring in Russia is, can we make the other oligarchs and elites hurt enough that they will do something? So, can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on that hope?
I'm so glad Stephen is here so we can talk about it together. But I do worry about the regime change and domestic criminology. First, let us remember what happened in Egypt. So we did have regime change. I'm not sure it was in the end of the day for the better. So we did have a military junta that is potentially as damaging to the country as the previous one, meaning before the Muslim Brotherhood, before the uprisings. But the economy is dominated by the military. People are afraid of talking about it, and it's doing military practices together with Russia at the moment, not even hiding it much, right? And but I'm not sure they did settle on Russian investment there as well. So that's what also worries me in Russia. You might have a regime change, but it doesn't mean that necessarily the more pro-democratic, less imperialistic government is going to come in immediately. Putin is really invested in propaganda from 2010-11 onwards. So he didn't start with aggressive propaganda. In a way, he started almost immediately, because you need to remember the first two Chechen wars, right? That that were also sort of whitewashed in Russia and presented a certain way. So the similar techniques are now being used for Ukraine. But really aggressive propaganda and repression started in 2010-11 after the demonstrations. So it's been going on for a long time. So people genuinely, some of them believe in some version of the events, maybe not fully Putin's, maybe they suspect something. But if the new leader comes in and tries to flip it overnight, you might not succeed in winning hearts and minds. So that does worry me. I don't want to probably leave to Stephen to comment about the imperialistic. There's been a lively debate about whether Russian opposition also has imperialistic tendencies that I am not qualified to comment on. But it is a concern. Oh, I wanted to say about the oligarchs. The issue now, the pain for the oligarchs of potentially being outside, being under foreign US sanctions or European sanctions, versus the fear of flying out of the window. I think they choose to stay on the first floor and not flying out to the window any day. They're definitely, the system has become so bloody that they would, I do not know what kind of pain we need to inflict on them to compensate for that worry for their physical integrity.
I'll add a couple other things. There's also domestic economic statecraft happening, where anytime one of those oligarchs publicly speaks out against Putin, they are quickly encouraged to sell their assets for pennies on the dollar, or they're killed or imprisoned, one or the other. So, the external pressure rarely rises to the level of the internal pressure. In terms of the Russian opposition and their imperialist tendencies, I won't speak a ton to that, but I do want to talk about the propaganda element. There's a really good presentation that I saw at a conference last summer. Basically, Russia owns almost all the media. The Russian state owns almost all the media in Russia. And even when there are sort of competitor news organizations operating, the majority of Russians trust the state media more than they trust the sort of free press. And that makes it very difficult to counter sort of the official propaganda narratives that are being pushed out into the news stations. I will stop there because I want you to have as much time as possible. But yeah, this is a really interesting topic. Thank you for that great question, Amir.
So I just wanted, because I didn't hear a possibility of Serbia scenario. What I want to say, I worked actually on the Serbia scenario in the first time of mission that came to Yugoslavia after the fall of Milosevic. So I would not even say that Serbia's scenario, especially in the early days, was so bad. Yes, there was a moment when Europe could have won much more with Serbia discussing the possibility of European accession. And I personally think that we lost an opportunity there. There was, at least for the government at the time, there was a strong desire. And I think, yes, there were the pressures from the other side, the fact that other war criminals were being hidden, not without support of the broader population and especially certain power groups. And of course, we did have the assassination then of the government officials later. But I think there might have been an opening. And that's actually a Serbia scenario for Russian regime change might not be such an atrocious scenario. Sorry, I was talking about Egypt, which is, I still think is worse than the Serbia scenario.
Thank you. So we'll move beyond Ukraine now and put a pin in that for a moment. What are your thoughts? This is a question from Dennis Pruitt. What are your thoughts on economic warfare related to obtaining critical minerals for a variety of sectors, including batteries?
I have colleagues, including at Peterson, that spend their full time on it, coming from security sector and moving into green. And then you think, why security and green? But this question clearly brings that forward. The problem is that, yes, as we move away and we diversify European reliance on away from Russian energy, you have important political issues and sort of moral issues of working with countries, whether it's Venezuela, Qatar, or others. But then you also have a problem where China, first and foremost, but also Russia and some of the emerging markets have dominance of this critical material so much needed for the batteries or for the, for the production that goes into the alternative energy and green. So yes, we have forgotten about this briefly, but no, Russia is an important export, and if it's not Russia, it is China. So if we keep on going in this fragmented world, we will need to tackle that issue of strategic dependencies as well.
Great, thank you. So we're out of questions in the chat, so audience, feel free to keep sending those in. But in the meantime, let's return to the topic of secondary sanctions. And I think the Iranian case is maybe the biggest, most notable one of the past decade or so. I could be wrong there, but certainly the one that I think of. Can you talk a little bit about why secondary sanctions then why they become important, why they're difficult to implement, and why we see them maybe more rarely?
So the secondary sanctions, you might not be a US entity, you might not be sort of, okay, there are extraterritorial application of sanctions and secondary sanctions, and maybe Stephen will help me here, but there's sort of the way I would explain it is that you might not be the US entity and you might not be sort of directly accountable to the US sanctions, but you might still lose access to US market or US dollar because you keep on transacting with somebody that US has put under sanctions. So that's how, and then we can get more into the detail of separating extraterritorial application with a secondary, and I don't want to go there because I'm sure I'll get confused. But that's how, let's talk about secondary sanctions this way. And Iran is exactly a very important example. And this is where Europeans got really scared. First, they understood that US will not always be our partner. And you have to think about it. Europe, especially as Europe as a project, has always had US in the background as an obvious, consistent transatlantic partner that we can always agree with on common values and projects. So I think for European Union, because it was born with that background, as a European Union project, it's assumed that, like it's almost like parents, that the parent will always be there in the same way. So I think it was a huge shock when Trump decided to pull out unilaterally from the deal with Iran. Then to add an insult to injury is when European companies came under risk of secondary sanctions. So they wanted to continue relationship with Iran. There was even this conversation of the special payment vehicle and this and that, which eventually, of course, went nowhere. But precisely because Europe is just too powerful, US is too powerful, and European Union companies, by dealing with Iran, would lose access to the US dollar, would lose access to US markets. And this is just too painful for them. They would cease to exist. The business with Iran is just not worth it. This is when a big chunk of European discussion about economic sovereignty actually started, it was not necessarily only in response to China, and I would say it was mostly as a response to the US when that conversation started. After that, you had Macron, you had German foreign policy, then you had European Commission becoming geopolitical. I think it has almost more to do with the US than it had to do with anybody else. And the most latest tool that came before the war on countering economic coercion tool that European Union was passing through is also, they frame it China, but I think they also have the US in mind. So that's why European Union is so reluctant to allow the US to use secondary sanctions, because if they use it for this and European Union supports it, that's what prevents US from turning around and using it against European Union. And I think also that's why this administration, because they believe in multilateral application of sanctions, that's why they're so cautious listening to European Union on this.
I'll add a little bit of extra background to the Iranian case. That was if the measurable end outcome or the measurable impact was preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons, that was the best sanctions economic statecraft package that could have possibly been negotiated. It was 100% likely, or maybe 99% likely, to achieve the end goal in a way that the entire world could, with the exception of maybe Israel or one or two other countries in the Gulf region, would agree was satisfactory. The ability to get that big coalition that then agreed, however reluctantly, to use secondary sanctions and everything else, it was a remarkable feat of international cooperation, and the US unilaterally pulling out of that deal has probably damaged our ability to use those tools again in the future very significantly. I will ask one more sort of related question, because one thing about the Iran deal that struck me was there were these harsh punishments, but there were also incentives on the other side. So the carrot and the stick, right? Like we know oftentimes about the economic warfare side of economic statecraft, but there is sort of a more positive side as well. Could you talk a little bit about whether or not sort of providing positive incentives versus punishments is more effective in terms of economic statecraft, or do they go hand in hand? Just your general thoughts on that.
It's a very good question, because I do have people saying that, oh, we have to start working on the project, sort of some carrots and sticks. We're so far on the sticks. It's almost hard to fathom the scenario under which you could be removing sanctions from Russia, but you're right, intellectually we should be prepared. And it's almost, to me, I get sort of, I don't even know what to say, because I had a few people who suggested to me, let's try to think about the project like that. It's very much forward thinking, but it is economic statecraft reality. We should have not only sticks, but carrots. In Iran's case, where Iran was desperate enough to get some cash, the fact that there was this special account where, the oil for food, and there was a special account where accumulated receipts, it was at some point big enough that Iran wanted to get its hands on that. It was an important bargaining tool. So I think that that is an example where it does work, credible scaling back of sanctions. An example where it doesn't work is the Jackson-Vanik, which has taught Russia that, there are two ways, there's executive order or there is legislative imposition of sanctions, and we know that legislative will never be taken off. So then that kind of removes the possibility of the authorities, in the case of the US, to actually offer anything to be taken off to the extent it's been codified in the law. So yes, I think we do have examples when it worked, but the other side has to also be desperate enough. And with Russia, I do not think we're there yet.
I think that makes a lot of sense. They seem to have done a really good job of at least attempting to sanction-proof their economy with some of the steps you mentioned earlier, particularly after 2014. Great. I guess the sort of last question that I have then, in case none others come up in the chat, is what are different ways we can incentivize third parties to join sanctions with us? I mean, you showed, graphs where China, which is really not surprising that they're stepping up, particularly given ongoing geopolitical problems with the US and Europe, but also India and Turkey and Iran and others. Egypt, I think you also mentioned. What are ways we can use economic statecraft to attempt to get them more on our side than continuing to help the Russian side?
I think we do have a chance with with countries like India or Turkey, more so than we have with China. With China, we're on such a divergent path that it's almost hard to find any topic on which there could be some degree of cooperation. And this is sort of the panda in the room. I think we have to tread here very carefully, because there has been a feeling in Washington, D.C., maybe especially in autumn, is that we've done, quote unquote, so well with Russia. Why don't we do the same thing with China? We have the same maximal response strategy with Taiwan. It's wonderful. Let's do it. I think we need to be more humble than that. First, as we discussed here, what does it mean how well we've done with Russia? China is a completely different animal, much more integrated with the US economy. Yeah, exactly. So it's much more complex and much more integrated. So what can we do on Turkey and India and others? I think it's again going country by country, case by case, and doing the same approach. Where do we have the most leverage versus they have vulnerability? Turkey needs to finance its current account and continue basically unsustainable macroeconomic policy. They need to have access for European markets as a result. Turkey also wants to still have a dance in NATO. Maybe it shouldn't be in NATO, right? So find where the pain points are and then give realistic sort of expectations, not the whole list, but expectations. The same thing with India. India maybe would like to continue buying Russian oil, but can we equip it better to get that Russian oil cheaper? The cap is a nice idea, but it doesn't seem like people are complying with that cap. Still very early data, but we need to keep on investigating it. But if from the economics, well, no, there is the caps do not work. You need it's a market friction that you need to lean in with everything you've got to somehow make it work for a little bit, right? So clearly we may be not leaning in enough, and then here our interest with India might be aligned, where India would like to continue refining Russian oil, continue maybe shipping products to the US and Europe. But can we help it to get even lower price than what it's getting now?
Great, thank you. I think, yeah, country by country, obviously, there's probably not a silver bullet that could just get everybody to magically do what we want. If there was, I'm confident somebody would have found it by now. There are no other questions in the chat. I want to thank Elina for being here and for the great talk and for the great Q&A session. I know I have learned a lot. This is a really fascinating and really timely topic. Elina, I'll give you sort of a chance for the last word here. If you've got a paper you want to plug or a future talk coming up or anything else like that, feel free to do so now.
Thank you so much. So I think my main take, or something I want to leave you with is that 2023 has to be the year of implementation and enforcement. Sanctions don't work if you just put them on paper and think that somehow everybody will run away and implement them. No, I mean, you need to have implementation and enforcement. And it's almost the more packages we announce, the more damaging it is, because it sort of spreads the efforts of the authorities into too many areas, and then you don't achieve anything at all. So I think that's the most important one. In terms of the paper, I just recently, I have my Twitter account. So it's Elina Ribakova on Twitter. I try to put the latest there with the work in progress there as well. And I really welcome comments. So the paper that came out on Russian imports, it's already there, and you have a link. It's together with Free Russia Foundation. And we're also working with Mark Follier, Mark Group on the next paper that should come out next week and hopefully featured in the press on Russian oil exports and to what extent they are still managing to get away from the cap and the embargo. Thank you so much, Stephen, for having me.
Thank you, Elena. Really briefly, I want to thank Elena, and I want to also thank our sponsors, UMSL Global and the World Affairs Council of St. Louis, and reiterate that these quality programs can only happen because of the support of the membership of the World Affairs Council of St. Louis. So please become a member today. More information is once again in the chat. Also, we have more of these speaker series coming up. The next one is about migration due to climate change. That will be Thursday, March 2nd from 12 to 1:30 p.m. and registration links are soon to be populated into the chat. Thank you all for being here, and thank you all for your attention. And once again, thank you, Elina, for the wonderful talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you.